All right, so we talked a little bit about this in the past, but I want to take a look at literals versus constructors and also talk about boxing and unboxing. So let's go ahead and create a string literal. I'm going to call it strlit and just set it to hello. Okay, so remember, a string is one of the 7 primitive types in JavaScript. Now, I can also create a string using a constructor. I can create what's called it's a string object. So let's say str obj and say new, and we're using the string constructor. Just like in the last video when we said new rectangle, which was our custom constructor function, this is also a constructor function. And we can pass in a string. And then what I'm going to do is console log the string lit and also the type of. So use the operator type of for string lit. And then let's do the same for the object. And we'll log the value of the object. So if I go ahead and save that, you see for the first one we get hello as the value and then string as the type. That's the literal. And then for the object, we get a string object with the text of hello. And it even gives us the index and the length. Okay, it also has a prototype, so it's an object. Now, what happens when we do, for instance, if I have a string literal and then I use 2 uppercase, what happens is something called boxing, because we can't use a method on a primitive data type, such as this right here. So what happens is behind the scenes, JavaScript adds a wrapper object to the literal and basically turns it into this using this right here. And that's called boxing. So we'll say that's boxing. All right, same thing if I were to use the index of a literal. Like if I do string lit and then brackets 0, that'll give me the first character. So we also have unboxing. So remember, boxing is when JavaScript adds the wrapper object onto a literal. Unboxing is when an object is turned back into a literal. So we can take the string object here. Let's say string object, and there's a value of method that we can use. So I'm going to say value of. Actually, you know what? Let's console log that. So we'll console the actual value, and let's also do type of, and then the string object, and then dot value of. So we'll save that, and there we go. So now you can see I started with an object, but we went back down to the literal using unboxing. Now, the reason we can use this method, value of, I mean, you see that it's not on the string object. There's no value of here. But if we look in the prototype, and we're going to go into prototypes very soon, just think of it as like kind of like an extra space that can hold other properties and methods and can be inherited and so on. But if we look in the string prototype, we have all the methods that we can use for strings. All these, we have length, match. What have we used here? Slice, search. So these can all be used on strings. But if we go down here, you'll see that it also inherits this object prototype. And if we look at that, that's where the value of method is. So when you use a property or a method on an object, it first looks directly at the object properties, then it looks in its prototype, and it'll keep looking in the inherited prototypes, which this object base is one of the inherited prototypes. All right, so that's boxing and unboxing. Now, because of boxing, there's still a constructor property on a literal. So let's go ahead and let's console log on the string lit. Now remember, this is a primitive data type, but let's say constructor. So if we do that, you'll see we actually get the constructor of the string object. So again, this boxing is going on behind the scenes. If I were to do string object, we should get the same exact thing. So we get the constructor function. We can also use the instance of operator to check if an object is an instance of a constructor function. Now in this case, the literal will actually return false. So let's say console log and string lit. We're checking to see if it's an instance of the string constructor. And notice we get false. So because it's a literal, we get false. So if we do it on the object, so on the string object, we get true. Okay, because it is an instance of string. Right here, we created an object, or I should say we created an instance of a string object using the constructor, which uses the new keyword. Now we have constructors for other types as well, for number, Boolean, array, and even function and object. So I'm going to paste in some of these. So I'm going to say other types. So here we have a number literal. We're just setting a variable to 20, but we can also create a number object using new and then number constructor. So I'm just going to save this. And if we look at the console log of the number literal, we get 20 and the type is number. If we look at the console log of the number object that was created from the constructor, we get the number object, which has a prototype and so on. And then the type for that is object. Okay, it's not number. Number is the primitive, which is the literal syntax. And then for Boolean, and by the way, if we were to use like toFixed or some kind of method on the literal, then JavaScript will do the boxing and it will add the wrapper object. Now for Booleans, same thing. We have a Boolean literal where the value is true, the type is Boolean, which is a primitive, and then we have a Boolean object where we have true, but we have object as the type. Now arrays, remember arrays are not a primitive value, they're objects, right? So when we log the type, whether we use the literal syntax or the constructor syntax, they're both the same thing, right? They're both same value and they're both objects. Now I want to start to get into some kind of weird stuff, and that is the function and the object constructors. So at least it's weird to me. So a regular function, I'm just going to call it funcLit. We can just do, function. We can pass in a parameter here. We'll say x, and then let's just return from this x times x. So we'll just multiply it by itself. All right. Now, if I console log here, funcLit, and let's also log the type of funcLit. If we do that, we get the function. It's not going to execute or invoke the function. It's just logging the actual function. And then for type of, we get function, which is still an object. It's a little confusing because it is still an object. It's just a certain type of object. Now, what's weird is that you can also create a function using the function constructor. So let's do this. Let's say const func obj, and we can say new function. And by the way, before we do that, I just want to show you, of course, we can execute funcLit. I'm going to do it in a console log because it just returns something. So let's say funcLit, and we'll pass in 5, and we get 25, right? It executes this function. Now, with the function constructor, I can pass in 2 arguments. The first is going to be the actual argument that gets passed into the function, so this right here. The second, and it gets passed in as a string. The second is going to be the function body, which I'm going to say return x times x. Now, to me, this looks really weird, but it is a way of creating a function. I can go ahead and execute it. We'll say func obj. We'll pass in 3, and we're going to want a console log. And if we run that, we get 9. So doing this is the same. We get the same result as if we do this. Now, when it comes to objects, if we say, let's say const obj, we'll say obj1 equals, and then just set it to an empty object. When I do this, behind the scenes, what JavaScript is doing is obj, I'll call this one 2 though. It's saying new and then object, okay, the object constructor. So if I were to console log obj1 and also the type of obj1, and then we'll do the same for 2, we should get the same exact thing. Okay, so you can see right here we're getting the same thing. So again, when we use the literal syntax like this, behind the scenes JavaScript is adding the new keyword and using the object constructor. All right, so in the next video, we're going to get back to working with our own object using our own constructors, but I just wanted to kind of go over this. I thought it was a good place to talk a little bit about these built-in constructor functions.